I belong to the worst prepared, maybe, worst organized participants of this panel, because I sent the topic of my remark too late, and that was not included in the paper, which I, of course, am very ashamed. But when I saw it, I thought that maybe what is there instead of the title of my remarks is the best answer to the question put on the screen. Can Asia solve its own security problems? To be decided. Because on the one hand, it's absolutely obvious that Asia should solve, has to solve its own security problems, because no one else will do it. I don't know any example in international relations and in human history, mankind's history, when one power would be eager to solve problems of another power. Of course, any outside powers only solve their own problems. Sometimes it coincides with problems of the region, sometimes not. So the question is whether Asia is prepared, is ready to solve it. I doubt, actually, not yet, at least. Interestingly enough, to us, especially to Russians, which traditionally were and still are pretty suspicious towards new trends in international relations and the global development, and the Russian approach to world politics is rather old-fashioned or traditionally minded. So to us it was pretty interesting to see all previous years that Asians, and in particular Chinese, were the most active and the most dedicated, committed fellows of globalization. Because Asia is maybe that part of the world which benefited mostly out of the system which was created by the West. But Chinese example and example of many other countries, India and other regional powers, shows that it was actually for those who were ready to work hard, it gave opportunities. But at the same time, it created a feeling which I felt many times visiting China or receiving Chinese colleagues in Moscow in previous years. The feeling that, of course, all this stuff about which Russians used to speak, geopolitics and security, that's very important, but, you know, in the contemporary world, something else is prevailing, and economic interdependence and globalized markets. It's not exactly eliminating the geopolitical rivalry, but certainly changes it in a very profound way. I think now the view is slightly different, even here, because almost all of us start to understand that globalized economy, of course, changes everything, or changes a lot in international relations, but all traditional sources for instability, sources for conflict, are unfortunately still with us, and there is no chance that we will get rid of it in the foreseeable future. What happened in the recent period, which can have impact on Asian security? First of all, I'm afraid we live in the era of collapsing order, be it global or regional. The Middle East has mentioned here many times in the first session. I would put it in a more blunt way. To me, the Middle East, as we knew it, is disappearing. We will never see recovery. It will be the regional situation will be completely different in years to come. The worst thing is that we cannot predict what kind of constellation in the Middle East will emerge, because what happens now is not geopolitical rivalry or even not the religious fight against Shia and Sunni. It's much worse. It's deconstruction of the whole regional order as created in 20th century after decolonization. We see that Islamic State is creating, actually not creating borders, but deleting borders. And what kind of new entities will emerge in that region? Absolutely no idea to everybody. Unfortunately, be it Americans, be it Russians or Chinese, we simply cannot stop it. It's started, and it's a profound change which will take years, if not decades. By the way, Taliban, which was mentioned here a couple of times in the Afghan context, I think I cannot exclude that in a couple of years' time, Taliban will be seen as a partner of Americans or Indians or Russians to confront much worse forces like Islamic State. So that's the reality of the changing environment. Shock waves sent from the Middle East will come to all of us. In Russia, as I know, the security services are more than concerned about the consequences of many Russians of Chechen or Muslim origin fighting in the ISIS, and one beautiful day they will come back, and that will be a completely different situation. Second change, Asia is now central to the political, economic, and even partly cultural development in the world, which means that attention paid to Asia in all respects, in positive and negative respects, is much higher. Europe, due to very turbulent history of previous decades and maybe even centuries, developed a system of managing risks, accompanying the central position of Europe in the international affairs. And in the Cold War time, the security system created in Europe was pretty stable. I mean, at least since 60s and 70s. Now the system is disappearing, but that's quite understandable because the whole all preconditions for that are changing. Asia during the Cold War time was rather peripheral. It was not the central piece of confrontation. That means that, on the one hand, less attention and less incentives to destabilize. At the same time, in Europe, powers knew that each conflict, each sleeping conflict, can become a major problem between two blocs, and they were quite careful in dealing with those, and they tried to find some compromises or some systems to manage risk. In Asia, it was not needed because it was not the central piece, but it is badly needed now, because now, since Asia becomes a central piece, and the legacy of the history here, as we know, is quite problematic. And that means that I agree with all said before, that Asia needs a new security arrangement, learning from Europe, but not copying, of course, because the security system which was established in Europe in the 20th century cannot be replicated here. Asians, all of us, should learn both positive and negative lessons from this. Third very important change is that Eurasia is back as an important and unified entity. What happens now between China and Russia is not just because Russia started to be treated as a hostile power by the West. Of course, Ukrainian crisis catalyzed this development, but that was absolutely inevitable, that Russia would turn towards Asia. Russia, I would remind all of us, because even in my country many people don't realize it, Russia is 3/4 of Russian territory is in Asia. 3/4. Russia is a nation country. We never thought in these categories because 3/4 of Russian population lives in European part. But it would be very strange for Russia not to have very active policy in Asia in the 21st century when Asia is in the middle of everything. While China turns west for understandable reasons, because any activities of China in Asia-Pacific now will be confronted with growing tension with the United States. And I think China is smart enough to understand that the Eurasian area in this regard is much more favorable, because there China rather will not see resistance, maybe quite the opposite, because all countries there, including Central Asia, Russia, and many others, they need Chinese engagement, they need Chinese money, they need Chinese skills. And I think that we are really entering the completely new era in relationship between, not only between Russia and China, but in the history of Eurasia. Unlike Eurasianism, which was popular in Russia before, and it was born 100 years ago as a manifestation, as a sign of looming collapse of Russian Empire, and that was a decadent philosophy at that time, actually, and that continued in this way until recently. There are very brilliant thinkers like Mr. Dugin, for example, but they represent really this decadent tradition. The new Eurasianism is extremely constructive and pragmatic, I hope so. And this Chinese contribution should be crucial, because China nowadays is much more pragmatically minded than Russia. That means that in Eurasia, new institutions will emerge or develop. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, also mentioned here before, and this year, as if I'm not mistaken, India and Pakistan should finally start to join this organization. SCO is yet not very active, and there is a crisis of identity building. But in the future, it might become the core organization of security and development in Eurasia, which can change a lot. And finally, Russia recalled that we are Asian power as well. The first step for us is to build our own perception of new Russia. And the next step will be to sell it, so to say, to community in Asia, because it's no secret that in Asia, Russia is not perceived as a nation power. And culturally, religiously, Russia will remain European, whatever Russian leadership wants. But this new approach, which is based on, to me, on the very promising assumption that alliances and confrontation in the 21st century are only to destroy relationship, not to build them. I think it's the very, very important attempt by Russia, by China, by other countries in Eurasia to give an example, actually, strangely enough, because we got used to take Western policies and Western approaches as example, but now in time of diversification of international development, there's a chance to demonstrate that Asian way to solve problems might be more efficient than others. But of course, what we need is Asia, real Asia, needs to start to think in not global now, but big regional terms, and Russia needs to understand that we are part of this region. Thank you.